In alignment with this year's theme of rights and responsibilities in history, I will be discussing the women's suffrage movement and how it ties into rights and responsibilities. The women's suffrage movement started in the early 19th century as a way for women to gain the right to vote. Later, the women's suffrage movement became about political equality and social reforms. To jumpstart change, women had to fight, march, and hold petitions just to get the same basic right to vote that men had. This right for women to vote became the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It would not have been possible if it were not for women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born on November 12, 1815 in Johnstown, New York, and she died on October 6, 1902. In 1840, Elizabeth married Henry Brewster Stanton, who was a lawyer and abolitionist. She then became active in the anti-slavery movement and an activist for women's rights. While on her honeymoon in London, she and her husband attended the World's Anti-Slavery Convention where she met Lucretia Mott, who was also disheartened about the unjust treatment of women. They became friends and worked together for women's rights. In July 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. This Seneca Falls Convention produced a list of demands called the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments was a document that outlined the rights that American women should have as citizens. Elizabeth Cady Stanton mostly wrote this document and it was signed by 100 attendees. Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820 in Adams, Massachusetts, and died in 1906. She was an abolitionist for slavery and served as an American anti-slavery agent. With this job, she organized meetings and made speeches. Susan B. Anthony's work towards the women's suffragist movement helped pave the way for the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony met Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851 and they worked together to gain equality for women for the rest of their lives. Susan B. Anthony traveled around the country to advocate for women's rights until her death, which was 14 years before women were finally given the right to vote. The National Women's Suffrage Association was founded in 1869 and was created by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Later in 1890, it merged with the American Women's Suffrage Association, which would be named the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The National American Women's Suffrage Association ended in 1920. In 1872, Susan B. Anthony and 14 other suffragists were arrested in Rochester, New York, after voting in the presidential election illegally. Susan B. Anthony was fined $100 by the court but never paid the fine. In 1890, Wyoming became the first state to give women the right to vote. Colorado became the second state to grant women the right to vote in 1893. In 1896, Utah and Idaho became the third and fourth states to grant women the right to vote. In 1910, Washington becomes the fifth state to grant women the right to vote. Another important key figure in the women's suffrage movement is Alice Paul. Alice Paul was born on January 11, 1885 in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. During Alice Paul's stay in England, she was put in jail on 3 occasions for suffragist agitation. Alice Paul returned to the United States, and in 1912 she became the chairperson for the Congressional Committee of the National Women's Suffrage Association. Alice Paul and a group of suffragists who also thought like her created the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, which was founded in 1913. In 1917, the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage merged with the Women's Party to create the National Women's Party. In 1919, the 19th Amendment passes the House and Senate. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified by 3/4 of the state and becomes law. After the women's suffrage movement, there was another movement called the Women's Liberation Movement. This was considered the second wave of feminism after the suffrage movement. This women's rights movement was targeted more towards work, politics, family, and sexuality. Thanks to these brave women between 1880 and 1910, the number of employed women increased from 2.6 million to 7.8 million. And today, women have equal rights as men.